talking about Riesling and why this has been such an important grape variety for us, and the Black Bow, why it has been also, I personally consider it, and again, this is only a personal opinion. I think that the history, our history, is best summarized um, through the development of the Black Bow, as well as just our attitude towards winemaking, towards responding to the environment. It is the Black Bow indeed, and our conversations with it on a yearly basis that give the most concrete examples of how we approach life and wine. And of course, as you all know, we do think that both are intricately connected, and why we make the decisions that we do. So the first Black Bow, well, first and foremost, Riesling. I hope if you're tuning in, you are a Riesling fan. Um, I've always been, even before stepping onto the production side, I've always been absolutely fascinated with the grape variety. It's got a reputation for being one of the most um, capable of terroir expression because of its capacity to be very, very transparent, despite the fact that it's very aromatic. A lot of Rieslings, like one of Riesling's signatures, is having for like just explosive aromatic, whether it's fruit, floral, sometimes petrol, and with regards to where it's made, obviously, like different regions can vary. Germany, of course, being and its different regions being the biggest example of the dry Riesling that has residual sugar in it, and it's a very complicated attitude that the Germans have with the Riesling, and deservedly so, because within Germany there's a universe of Riesling expressions. But if we're talking in generalities, Germany will be the source of Riesling that are very crystalline, very ballerina-like, almost always have some residual sugar in them. But because their acids are so high, that residual sugar is not does not translate on the palate necessarily as sweetness. Now, if you move from Germany a little bit west to Alsace, you have Rieslings that are actually much, much, much drier, and wines of more structure, more plushness. Same thing happens in Austria as well, another source of beautiful Rieslings. And that's not to say that Alsace and Austria don't produce Rieslings of aromatic complexity, but the highlight within those bottles are how the structure relates to what Riesling naturally carries. While in Germany, when you talk about structure, that is a structure that's based on sugar acid ratio. In Alsace and in Austria, you have a completely different behavior of the Riesling. Same goes, well, not same, Australia, the Clare and Eden Valley, they have had a particular style emerge there as well. Much warmer regions, obviously. They say that Australia's aromatic signature is green lime flower, lime fruit, all of it. And they also tend to be much drier in general. Now, when we talk about Niagara, the history here is very interesting because Riesling has been one of the first vinifera varieties planted within the area. And the clone that it's most prominent, pretty much, I don't want to say 100%, but the vast majority of the Riesling planted on the bench area, it's what is known as the Weiss clone. That's because it was imported by Hermann Weiss, a German that was one of the original believers in the capacity of this vine to produce outstanding wines here in Niagara. And then going towards Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is supposedly not as great for Riesling just because it's somewhat warmer there, you have a predominance of the Alsatian clone 43. It's just like called clone number 43. Now, We don't really talk much about clones within our winery, not because of anything else. You can learn a lot from clones, but if you're producing wines and defining their characteristics from a clonal perspective, this is just how they put it, like a just minute detail. So if the characters of your wine can be identified just as the characters of the clone, means the vine has not fully adapted yet and is not translating the environment in a more eloquent way, or you're concentrating on things that are actually not that important. Clonal selection is important when it comes to choosing the right clone when planting for the climatic conditions that you have, for the soil conditions that you have. Apart from that, after the first couple of years, our hope is always that we'll go over like we just never pay attention to the clonal selection unless we are planting something and we want to make sure that we're doing making intelligent decisions. I say this because somebody recently asked me what's the clone on our 19th Street vineyard where the black bow always comes from. And we have no idea. We've never done the research because we did not plant that vineyard. We bought it already planted. My best guess would be that it is the vice clone, just because that is the majority that's planted all along the different benches in Niagara, but we cannot guarantee you that at all. We've also worked with some Riesling in Niagara-on-the-Lake. They're the Cuvée Sputniks. Is it the Alsatian clone? Most likely. Can I give you a guarantee? Absolutely not. Now, when Francois first arrived here, and I'm sure you're all aware that what Niagara established its reputation for in terms of Riesling was Rieslings that are made in the mold of German Rieslings. So always with residual sugar, high acidity, which is a natural function of the Riesling grape itself. And Niagara, as we've talked before, across grape varieties, has the capacity to express with a lot of lushness in fruit, a lot of richness and density. So you have that in Riesling as well. They can be very delicate on the nose, but not as delicate as the German ones. There's always more richness. There's always more amplitude. There's always more to like sink your teeth in. And we did a Riesling in 2009, which is not a black bowl. And that was the only time Francois did a Riesling based on the recipe of the area, which is when he asked how you do Riesling, because he didn't come from any Riesling background, like absolute zero. People in the area said, well, you have to ferment it cold. First thing we don't do, we do not ferment cold. Second, you have to stop fermentation at a place where the sugar and the acid you perceive to be in balance. Second thing we don't do, we do not interfere with fermentation. We let it run its course. Then you have to sulfur. Third thing we try to do in very, very minimal, kind of in a minimal mode, only to assure some stability of the wine, but never to remove any active yeasts. And then you have to sterile, fine, and filter. So sterile filtering is when you remove everything from the wine that can possibly, create any problems in the future. So that's a fourth thing we don't do. So anyway, he did that Riesling. Still, even when he was following the recipe, he didn't follow it full on. He fermented it at normal temperature, and it was again much drier than the rest of the Niagara Rieslings that you can encounter. We're talking about 10 grams of residual sugar. It's what the sweetness is measured with, versus anywhere between 12 to 24 and sometimes even 30 that you can find in the area. And that wine was not released until I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, uh, when it was the first time we actually liked it. Now, there was absolutely nothing wrong with it. It was just a very good quote unquote Niagara Riesling, but neither him nor I have a taste for sweetness, sugar, and like what I call forced balance. Because, we were discussing balance the last couple of times a little bit, but for those of you that haven't been, I just don't believe that from a craftsman perspective, you can invent a balance that's truer and more complete than the balance that the wine will naturally give you if you let it run its course. So that wine, again, 2009 Riesling, nothing wrong with it. It was just a little bit clunky to us. It took 10, 12 years for us to like it. And why we liked it, it's because as it aged in bottle, actually, this is a very interesting thing that also happens in Riesling, it got drier. And that is not through re-fermentation in bottle, but because Rieslings have sugar in Riesling has the capacity to polymerize and build longer chains, which slowly but surely make the wine drier, not only in perceptions, but technically. So before releasing it last, whenever it was, uh, it had gone from, we measured it, and it had gone from 10 to 4 grams, under 4 grams of residual sugar. So that is a good 6.5, 7 grams that have digested without re-fermenting in bottle. Now, that page aside, 2010 comes, and Francois decides to do the Riesling like he'll do any other wine and stick to what he believes, what we believe wine is. Like, don't interfere, let it find its natural balance and uncover what it is. So the 2010 Riesling goes completely dry. And when I say completely dry, I don't mean technical dryness, I don't mean perceptual dryness. I mean complete technical dryness of 0 grams of residual sugar. Then it does a second thing that is supposedly a huge no-no here in the area. It goes through what is called malolactic conversion, which is a secondary kind of, some people call it fermentation, but it's technically not a fermentation, it's a conversion, where malic acid, which is the acid that is found in apples and any sort of fruit, hence the name from Latin mela, malic, to lactic acid, which is a much softer acidity that's found in dairy. So malolactic conversion is something that people sometimes, if they want richness in the wines, will artificially inoculate for. If they want extremely steely wines, will block it. And it's considered a tool that you can use to push the wines to one side or the other. Now, again, we don't do that. And Niagara actually happens to have naturally very high number of malics year in and year out. So the malolactic conversion every single year in every single one of our wines is wild. We've never inoculated for it, and we don't block it. Because if the wine wants to do that, the wine should be able to do that. So 2010, completely dry Riesling, completely like a full 100% malolactic conversion. This is, I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story, why, like, of the beginning of that name, the Cuvée Black Bow, where it came from. Delicious wine, not unlike any of the rest of the Riesling, not like any of the rest of the Rieslings in the area, but absolutely wonderful. That is actually the wine that made me stop in my tracks before, when I was working like a sommelier, and just like started, I was exploring the area. I tried the 2010 Black Bow, and I'm like, what the F is that? It's unlike anything that I've ever tasted. but it's delicious. It's like, it's Riesling. And I'm like, oh, great. So we can do Rieslings like that. Great. Like, why, how, these are questions that I can further explore if I'm willing to, but I didn't have, and it's not because I made it a point to be open-minded, but just the wine was delicious. So it was never a challenge to me to accept that Riesling can be this, or, a concoction that is made based on a sugar acid ratio. Um, so at that point, I was actually a sommelier in Toronto, and I think it was 130 cases of the Black Bow in 2010, the total production. And Ascari, where I was working at the time, we ended up selling, I think, like 100 of those cases. And I just kept obsessing with it. It was my first big Pearl Morissette love. And inadvertently, all the Rieslings that have followed in Cuvée Black Bow have continued to hold that position. I deeply love all of our wines, but when it comes to the Black Bow, it's like the crazy switches on and it's like off to the races. It is so funny that even for a while, Francois didn't even like it. He's like, oh, I don't like it. And it's not because it was different. It's like, I just don't fully understand it. I don't know what's going on there. What kind of Riesling is that? We always joke, even to this day, he'll be the first person to tell you that I made him like the Rieslings that he makes. And my line is always that if for some crazy reason Pearl Morissette is known 100 years from now, what will be remembered, apart from hopefully the great quality and expressiveness of the wines, it will be the Black Bow, because it is, I truly believe, it's a wine that is in the process of discovering and then establishing a reference, establishing a very unique, some people would call it idiosyncratic style, that again, it's not of our invention. We can only take credit for the discovery of it, but though what led us to the discovery is one thing and one thing only. It's the processes of following the wine and not imposing any bias on it. So 2010, stainless steel, because we rarely ever use stainless steel here, just because within the fermentations that we do, we always like to have, either I was talking before, the concrete or the foudre containers that allow for some slow oxygen ingress. But what stainless steel is good for is to kind of, especially if you haven't worked with a grape variety, is to kind of give you a sketch, like an outline of what the wine is like. So 2010 comes around, we do the wine, it gets submitted to the VQA tasting panel, which is like a step that every single wine produced in Niagara has to go through, and which is another one of our claims to fame or infamy. We hold the dubious position of being the winery that failed the most wines. All of them have never, ever failed lab, which assures that the wine is biomolecularly stable and all sorts of other technical things. Have never failed provenance, which is the assurance that the fruit that you're working with is 100% Ontario. Every single one that's been struck down has been for during the tasting panel, and most of the time for being atypical for the grape variety. And we can continue exploring that topic. I don't really want to start with it straight from the get-go because it's a deep, dark well. But the Black Bows are the wines that routinely fall VQA tasting panel. Funnily enough, the 13 and 17 that are the stars of the show today are the two that actually passed. And if you ask us why, we have no idea, because they're as difficult, if not more difficult than the rest of the Black Bows. But as I always joke, somebody was in a good mood in the tasting panel and passed them. Every single other one of our Black Bows um, has failed. Even when we first passed the 13, I'm like, okay, that battle was won. No more, you know, failing the VQA tasting panel with the black bowl, but the 14 and 15 failed right away afterwards. So when Francois was explained that you cannot have the VQA denomination or like passive approval, our other partner who is Mill Pearl, that's where the first part of our winery name comes from, I said to him that he's been blackballed. And Francois didn't know what that means. You know, Mel explained it to him. And since then, I don't know whether I can. So this is a normal VQA logo right here at the back. Can everybody see it? It just says it's a black square that says VQA in it. But since then, since 2010, we invented our own logo, which is obviously only recognized by us and nobody else. And instead of a VQA, it's got a black bow at the back. So considering some of your probably fans, you know that not only is our the Riesling, the top Riesling called Cupid Black Bow, so is our wine club and any other wine that is also failed VQA, because we also have some Chardonnays that didn't pass and other ones. They will always have the VQA, our black bowl at the back. Now, the funny thing with the black bowl is because it was an unknown material for us, it is even more important to listen to what the wine wants to tell you, to be open-minded enough to follow where it wants to go, but at the same time to be attentive in order to understand where it's gonna feel like, in what kind of vessel it's gonna be most comfortable with. So in 2011, we did the majority of the black bowl in stainless steel tank, continuing with trying to understand it. But then there were 3 barrels of neutral wood that were an experiment. That wine, if anybody has 2011 Black Bowl Barrique, it says on the label, in their cellars, it is drinking absolutely beautiful right now. It's very open. It's the first of the Black Bowls that is now fully showing how much those Rieslings have to give. So from 2011 and that experiment in neutral barrel, we decided that Riesling really likes being in old woods, but it's sort of, you know, I was talking last week about, or the week before, I don't remember, Niagara wines or musts seemingly being way more comfortable in larger volume containers. And that was the same perception we had from the 2011 that inspired the initial acquisition of 2 Foudres, of those guys that we now have 26 or 27 of. There were just 2 first in 2012, and the sole reason for us buying them was the Riesling. That Riesling that I will open, and I'll tell you the story after, was an absolute revelation. And since then, we've had the 2013, different, you know, the following year, also in 100% Foudre. The 2014 Black Bowl went into 100% concrete without any Foudre. The reason for that being that 14 was a year of very light structures, so you can actually really stifle the wine if you put it in Foudre. The best thing to do is concentrate on the aromatic complexity of the wine, and the best vessel for that is concrete itself. From 15 onwards, every single year, the Black Bowl's been in a combination of Foudre and concrete, because again, those 2 vessels highlight the 2 aspects, the 2 columns of identity that Riesling carries here in Niagara. A lot of structure, a lot of toughness, just very pliant, beautiful palate that stays quite closed for quite a long time, but at the same time, a lot of beautiful, beautiful perfume that in the beginning of its life, you can not, like, the wine closes on itself and you cannot really get to that perfume. But once it goes through a few years of bottle aging, like the 13 has been, uh, the fruit returns, the wine digests its meat, and the fruit explodes. And without sounding too out there, I'm telling you, it is an absolute experience. The 2013 Black Bowl, 2 to 3 hours after hours, 2 to 3 years after bottling, was a fully, I don't want to say undrinkable. You can drink it, but I remember people coming who used to do tastings at that time, and they were wanting to taste it because even at that point it had created a lot of buzz. And I used to say, like, if you want to know what it feels to be halfway electrocuted and halfway like slapped vigorously, just take a couple of sips of the 13 Black Bowl, because the high acidity, the toughness, um, the refusal of the wine to open up, it was not a wine that you can leisurely drink. It's like you don't need any coffee in the morning, have a sip of the 13 Black Bowl. It's like live electricity running through you. If you are to taste it now, as I just did, the wine blooms, like absolutely blooms out of the glass. I'm actually going to pour myself a little bit more because it has had the time again to digest all this profound structure that it carries. And I wanted to talk to it, to talk about it side by side with the 17, because those two vintages are rather similar. So if you have 13 Black Bowls anywhere in your cellars, or if you don't and you're curious, on the Black Bowl part of our website, there's still, I think, another 25 or so bottles because we released a small proportion a couple of weeks ago. What it's showing you now, it is where the 17 is headed, and hopefully it will also be in a much better place because, again, we've learned quite a few things in between. But there is a very seamless and straight parallel between those two wines as children of extremely similar vintages. Cool climate vintages. Riesling, by the way, is a grape that likes cool weather when people and long growing seasons with no extremes. When people talk about such and such vintage and grape, it's great in Niagara, most of the time the conversation revolves around warm and hot vintages, which is great for grapes that normally struggle to ripen in Niagara. Let's say Cabernet Sauvignon or like Syrah or like these late ripening red varieties. Those vintages are not the best for Riesling. If anything, they're quite challenging. That being said, the 12, that is my favorite wine of all time, as well as the 15 Black Bowl, which is still unreleased, come from two rather warm vintages, but I absolutely love the gildedness they have. Just that beeswaxy, like dripping golden sunshine note within the perfume that come within a completely dry palate, right? Normally when you smell that kind of richness, you expect to have something sweet on your palate when you taste it. And none of those Rieslings ever have any sugar. So regardless of the wildly varying vintage conditions from 2010 till 2019, even different vineyard sites, because we've done Rieslings from not only from 19th Street, but we've purchased some fruit from around the area as well. Different élevage and fermentation vessels, be it only concrete, only foudre, combination of both. The Riesling has absolutely always done the absolutely same thing, which is go completely dry, go through full malo, close after bottling, and then you wait a couple of years and you're in for what I consider one of the biggest treats Niagara can provide. Um, what is very interesting about that too is that despite the fact these are wines that, you know, not unpurposely or purposely, that doesn't matter, are being punished here. And like when I say punished, it's just being denied approval by the regulatory body, which is important from a tax perspective. Those are actually the wines that turn the heads, first and foremost in Germany, in the mothership of our Riesling. These, like, the Germans get absolutely obsessed with it, and not within a very different type of with like attitude, because they're not like, oh, this doesn't taste like Riesling. They say this doesn't taste like any other Riesling we have tasted. And for me, this is exactly the way we need to be approaching the fruit of a new young region like Niagara, not to force wines into the pre-existing references like German Riesling in that sense, but to see, can they give us wines of world-class quality that at the same time speak the idiosyncratic language of Niagara that we're lucky enough to have. So it's a very like, well, it would be, I mean, I like, at this point we're so used to it that we think it's funny, but it can be also quite frustrating that you know, the wines like this that are turning the heads of like German specialists, German industry people, and we export quite a lot of it to Germany as well, are here considered somehow unworthy because they're not like the rest of Niagara Rieslings. And my argument always is that if, without us interfering, and all these different conditions that we encounter along the years that I mentioned, all the different data in terms of vineyard, vine age, élevage and fermentation vessels, if they all produce the exact same results in terms of the technical behavior of the Riesling, call me crazy, but I think that's a pretty strong argument for typicity, because the rest of what is being produced, you can't produce Rieslings of sugar acid ratio in Niagara unless you interfere repeatedly. Nothing wrong with that, but that doesn't make a wine typical. That makes a style of a wine typical, but it's a completely different question. So our argument's always been, allow us to do what we want to do, because we don't like, we're not doing it with like, let us be different. We're just following the wine, and the wine and nature in all its wisdom, having gone through the processes within the materials that we have, is saying, you know what, there's a different balance than sugar balancing acidity here in Niagara, because sugar and acid balancing here does not happen naturally. How I'm gonna soften, you know, the very high acid that Riesling naturally carries is by converting its molecular structure from malic into lactic, which mellows it down. So when you have sugar acid ratio being the core of the German Rieslings, it comes from a very different type of material. pH, not to go too nerdy, but pH levels that are like much lower than ours here, acids that are much higher. So the wine naturally stops fermenting with some residual sugar in it, because if you have a wine with 13 grams of acidity in it and a very low pH level, which just exacerbates the feeling of acidity you have in your mouth, let me tell you, you need sugar in that wine, because otherwise you're drinking battery acids. So that's what happens in Germany with those grapes in those soils on those conditions. Here we are first a much warmer region, completely different soils, completely different pH levels, completely different acidities. And what happens when you let the Riesling do its thing? It balances itself in a completely different way. So that's my rant about typicity and being atypical on the other side. But I'm gonna stop just to make sure I'm not skipping through 1,000 questions, and then we're gonna talk about why Riesling takes so long to come around, and what are all the pleasures that it can provide you with. Because I truly think it's one of, you either have Riesling lovers, and I may be wrong, but even when we were doing tastings, most of the time, you know, when customers would come, they would say, no, I hate Riesling because it's sweet. So it doesn't need to be sweet. That's one thing. But the people that really like Riesling tend to be more on the um, industry types, not for any other reason, but because generally speaking, at least in the past 10 years, there hasn't been a good influx or import of good German wines within the country. So when you are drinking Rieslings that are sweet and they're not really from the best of producers, you normally are also drinking wines with a lot of sulfur in them, which leads to a lot of, or can lead to a lot of headaches. And then that perception of sweetness is not really good with many different types of food. So overall, I've had a little bit of a negative feedback in terms of like Rieslings that are sweet. And most people are always very surprised when they taste the Black Bowl. They say like, oh, it's completely dry. And that allows it to be extremely flexible in terms of food pairings and stuff like that. But even without the food pairings, I personally like to spend a lot of time with these wines because when they're open and as they open through the years, they keep on um, not adding, but revealing layers and nuances that are so subtle, but so precise that if you are in a poetic mood, you can certainly lose yourself into a bottle of a serious Riesling. And also, you can age it for a long time. As I said, the 2013, it's only in the past year and a half that's actually showed signs of opening. The other day, I was writing to Eric, who's here, like how much longer about the Black Ghost, and I'm like, I honestly have no idea, but at least another 10 years easily. They're as long lived as the Cabernet Francs, if not more so. I'll be very interested, like, you know, hopefully in 20 years to be able to compare the vibrancy of the 13 Black Bowl Riesling next to the 13 Cabernet Franc Madeleine and see which one are like, you know, how they compare. Because the acidity in Riesling helps it age like very well, and add that to the structure that Niagara has. It has everything that's needed for a long life to happen. Okay. Oh, somebody has 6 2013s in their cellar. That's amazing. Oh. So why the 2013 side by side the 2017? I did, like, I kind of touched up on that one. There are differences between those two vintages, meaning the 13s, the 13 wines have a little bit like deeper roots. They're more like symmetrical anchored wines, while the 17s have higher crowns, if I can make that difference. They're more aromatically complex. But in their core, in the relationship of the building blocks that make the wine, they're very similar. So even though the 17, I'm sure, will be different in 6 years than the 13 is now, generally speaking, those two vintages are like, if not mirrors, like they're like reflections of each other. You know, for me, like now with 14 years here behind our backs in terms of harvest, you start to identify similar behaviors between vintages, even though the vintages are not identical. So 13 and 17 are that couple. Like the behavior of our 13s over the years really helped inform our choices in 2017. And even though the 17 Black Ball never felt, because that wine was bottled in the beginning of harvest last year, so September last year. So it's not, I mean, it's as a bit like as young as it gets. The 13 at that stage of its life was that electrocution slap combo that wasn't necessarily the most pleasurable experience. The 17 is not like that at all. It's actually quite mellow. I wouldn't call it open, but it's not aggressively closed as well. What is interesting about it is that currently it expresses a lot of its salinity. The salinity, or some people would call it minerality, we call it salinity here, that's in its core. Not so much of the fruit. The fruit only expresses more on the kind of floral pretty side, but not at all in an explosive way. So before we had to close the restaurant, they were actually using the 17 Black Ball in pairings, as if it was a Muscadet or Albarino, which are very saline, minerally driven wines. So they would pair it with, some of the oyster preparations or some other fish dishes where you didn't want much fruit, but you wanted the salinity within the wine to highlight the salinity or like the savory components within the dish. It also, because again, it's within that quiet fruit phase. I personally had it last night at home with some semi-firm goat cheese. You can even think about it a little bit as Sauvignon Blanc. Again, not in terms of the fruit, but in terms of the crispness, that like fresh, appley, juicy experience, like that you can bite into. Now, as it continues aging, it'll get closer and closer to the Riesling or an identifiable Riesling character per se, because what happens is the fruit starts filling out, the spiciness of Niagara opens, and while the wine is still very fresh and vibrant, it won't be like the 13 right now. There's acidity, but it's very textural. It's not like racing acidity. I call it the autobahn acid. It's like zoom, just like from front to back in your palate. And it's like, oof, what just happened? It's more of a tactile experience that covers the whole of your mouth and keeps the wine lifted. Definitely more than any Chardonnay, just by the sheer fact that Riesling is a grape that carries inherently way more acidity than Chardonnay does. So you always have more vibrancy in Riesling than in Chardonnay. And as it ages, that acidity just mellows out, but still shines. That's why a lot of people talk about some aged Rieslings, be it from Alsace, from Austria, from Germany, as wines that shine. What allows them to shine, even through the, because with age, the fruit would lose its freshness and become more of, a golden hue, more honeyed. But with the acidity that remains, that gives a lift to the wines that makes them like pretty beguiling. Little trivia, the German Rieslings, as recently as the beginning of last century, were considered, not only wine of the kings, but were the most expensive wines in the world. They fell out of favor for a variety of reasons, overcropping, because when you overcrop Riesling, it's very easy to come up with a wine that's not much different than like lemon juice or whatever. Um, and there were a few scandals in the German wine industry in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, early 80s, where I think, I forget the exact details now, but there was antifreeze being used. It's just like not good things. So it became this huge no, and people forgot that Riesling, be it from Germany, Austrian Rieslings are absolutely wonderful too, or Rosas. Those are all wines of extreme nobility. It was way more highly regarded than the finest Chardonnays. Uh, and I would absolutely argue that to this day, Riesling, in terms of quality you can find the best quality per price ratio, especially, no, across the board, regardless of whether you want something young and vibrant that is not going to age for a long time, or something serious that you can drink with your children and grandchildren. Riesling is definitely over Chardonnay for me. But I'm also a Riesling freak, so don't take everything I say for granted. When would you recommend opening the 2017 to experience the same thing as you're now on the 13th? So, if I am to extrapolate from what we saw in the 13th, so the 13 started opening up in 2019, so 5-6 years. That being said, I don't think the 17 will take as long because, as I said, it's not as deeply rooted. It's more on the aromatic side. And another big difference between those two wines is that the 13 is a wine that is 100% food re-fermentation and aging. While in 17, you have around a little bit, like probably around 60% concrete and 40% food. So what that means is that while in 13, you had the already existing structure of the wine itself structured even more by the foudre, because that's what they do. They really anchor you. In 17, because we concentrated, like we didn't want to weigh down the wine, we gave it a little bit more concrete. So its bones are a little bit more pliant. So, I mean, I am drinking it now and it's delicious, but what are you going to be experiencing now? It's a wine, as I said, that's more on the saline side. What I would recommend, like, with all of our wines, but with the 17 Riesling even more so, if you open a bottle on Monday and continue checking on it, I mean, pour yourself a glass so there's some oxygen in the bottle and drink it over the course of a week or 10 days, the way the wine will open up, you will see the fruit emerging. You will see deeper into its character, and you understand what more is inside the body that it's now on the quiet side. If I have to make an educated guess as to how long it'll take to start really singing, I would probably say like 4 more years or so. But again, this is the first cool vintage of Black Bow since the 2013 one, and it's made slightly differently the 13. So it's just a guess, but that, like, yeah, for 4 more years or so. Then how long it'll live afterwards? A long time. Yes, so somebody saying like that. Somebody, it reminds them of a young Chablis. That's exactly it. That's the same idea, or the same characteristic between that makes the Albarinius and Muscadets, Chablis as well. So high prevalence of mineral/saline notes, firm acidity, and fruit that is secondary to the overall character of the wine, as opposed to fruit leading the parade. There's always, now, if we have to make a comparison, and I actually done this for students of the Sommelier Factory in Toronto, we had a few other Black Bow Rieslings mixed blindly in a tasting of dry Rieslings from around the world, just to see, you know, what people think, and are they gonna all of a sudden interpret them as the VQA tasting panel interprets them and say it's like, oh no, this is not Riesling. And it is fascinating to discover the parallels that exist between here and Alsace and Austria versus Germany. And this is another one of my like rants. Like, there's absolutely no reason for us in Niagara to think that the German type of Riesling is the character that we should be that we should be drinking Niagara. There's a historical reason for it, meaning that the person that first brought the German, the clone here and believed that Riesling was German. So that's the kind of wines they drank. But funnily enough, if you are to listen, because I've talked to quite a few other winemakers now that also been inspired enough by the Black Bowl to try and do dry Rieslings. And when I asked them what happened when you ferment it naturally and let it be, it happens in their cellars too. It ferments dry. And it emerges as a character close to these, more so than anything that's been, you know, that's been promoted as the Niagara type of Riesling. Now, why I'm saying that is that if we, if we step, again, not to repeat myself 1,000 times, but from the idea of emulating and imitating others, nature is very good in showing you what you have on your hands. And not only that, but through a blind tasting, alongside Austrian and Alsatian Rieslings, you see that these guys are not outliers at all. They fall within the same general category. They just express a particular type of perfume. And again, that's spicier, let's say, than most Alsatian ones. And it can be, and the wines are a little bit brighter because some of the Alsatian Rieslings, they tend to, like, as opposed to the German Rieslings, the Alsatian ones are kind of, I don't want to say heavy, but on the dense side, and they brighten up as they age, which is the exact thing that happens here. The exact same thing happens here. So it's not, I remember when I had we had one of the best winemakers in the world. He's an Alsatian guy and highly, highly regarded. Olivier Zinkumbrecht present some wines to sommeliers in Toronto. It has probably been like 2004, like 2014 or so. And he was opening all sorts of Rieslings. Gewürztraminer is another one. Pinot Gris. All Alsatian grape varieties that are also common here, and asking people like, can you tell me which one did not go through that malolactic conversion? Now, why that question created a furor, it's because here people are told that those grapes do not go through malolactic conversion. It's some sort of a rule. I don't know who invented it, who popularized it, but it's completely ridiculous because he was so taken aback by their reaction. He's like, what, like, why are you guys so like up in arms? And like, he's like, and you know, there's somebody saying like, no, those grapes, they shouldn't go through malolactic conversion. It's like, depends on the vintage, depends on the site, depends on the age of the vines, depends on water access, depends on so many different things. But there's certainly not this hard written rule that Riesling doesn't go through malolactic. It doesn't go through malolactic in Germany. It absolutely does in Austria, and it absolutely does in many of the Alsatian vineyards. And all of that is yet another insight into how much we can, how do I put it? We can limit ourselves from experiencing the greatness and the true identity that Niagara can give every single one of the grape varieties. But the Riesling is really kind of the one that stands and leads, the parade, because it's so different than what people think it should be. But you know, like, nature is not asking us what we think is good, what we don't think is good. That grape has, that vine has evolved within the area, has accustomed itself to the soils that are here, to the climatic conditions that we see from one year to another. Like, it's much warmer here. There are many other factors in play. And it's saying, you know what, Riesling in Niagara does like something completely different than Riesling in Germany does, and that is perfectly okay. That is definitely not a qualitative definer. Even more so because now it's very interesting too. As the weather is warming up, you see German Rieslings get drier and drier and drier and drier. To the point that there's a lot of them that are fully dry and some of them that go through mallow, because what the fruit is doing there, it's starting to behave or digest like the same conditions that for us have been a given here. This is our modus operandi. While for Germany's had in the past 5 years, the four of them have been the vintages of the century. And they're not overly exaggerating. They're actually in a place where they've been struggling to ripen, much like in Burgundy it's happening. In Germany now they have perfectly ripe fruit all the time. And when you put that ripe fruit through the process of fermentation, it actually goes to a point that is at much the wine stops at much lower sugar levels than they're used to. So I don't want to say they're catching up with us because that would imply we're ahead. We're not. But the differences are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It's anybody's guess where we'll go from here. But I know that the one thing that we shouldn't do is try to imitate things that do not belong or do not apply to these conditions that we have in Niagara, and are also very unlikely to start applying, just because it is like we have a warm growing season to start with, and it's only getting warmer. So even if in a cool vintage here we still go completely dry, warm vintages are definitely gonna do that 1000% of the time. Where does the alcohol usually land? The alcohol depends on the vintage. The 20 normally about the 11-12%. So the 2012 is at 11.5, 11.5 for the 13 as well, and 12% for 2017. Which now this is a very funny thing, because generally speaking, if you are to assume which will be the one of the highest alcohol, it should be the 12, because that is the warmest year. Much like it was what warm? Hot and dry. While in 17 you have like the rainiest of vintages, and 13 another rainy vintage, not as much as 17, and not necessarily as cool, but still. Now, this is just a sign to be interpreted in a completely different way than what you normally think when you talk about alcohol in wine. Because obviously, alcohol is a function of the sugar ripeness of the grapes. And if we were ripening the grapes for sugar, we're gonna have the sweetest grapes in 2012, hence the biggest wine in terms of alcohol. Now, we do not ripen for sugar, we ripen for skin ripeness, or phenolic ripeness it's called. And that is the development, phenolic ripeness is the development of flavors on the skins of the grapes, as well as, pardon me, the tannic structures that will come from the seeds, and so on and so forth. And our approach in the vineyard is very different. Like I remember in 2012, because it was so hot and so dry, that's generally a cause for celebration among many Niagara wineries. Now, in our case, that is it's a tricky situation because your sugars are synthesizing so quickly, your phenolic ripeness can actually lag further and further behind. So you can have, even in terms of the reds, wines of high alcoholic strength with green flavor still. So for us, in our viticultural practices, it's always how we keep those two hand in hand. We honestly, we couldn't care less about the sugar. There's one time, it's only towards the end of harvest, to the end of the season, when we're like, are we going to pick today? Are we going to pick tomorrow? When we start making those decisions, when we measure the sugars. And that's not for any other reason, but because when you have to declare what you're picking to the grape growers of Ontario, and part of the declaration requires the bricks. Otherwise, we couldn't care less about the sugars. It's always about the flavors, and those you assess through a tactile experience of like chewing on the skin, munching on the seeds. So in a year like 2012, we actually on purpose left as much fruit on the vines as possible so the sugar synthesis can slow down because the vine will have more grapes to ripen, and this way allow the flavor development to catch up with the grapes. So you don't necessarily end up with more sugar in a year that is hotter. So for us, that is a thing that can be very surprising when you look into the different vintages, how that sometimes hotter vintages can have lower alcohol than cooler ones. And that is one of the practices that we employ, or leaving all the foliage on, the canopy as much as possible. So also the vine spends energy in producing, like feeding those leaves, and doesn't synthesize so much sugar within the grapes. Plus, of course, they provide shade to the grapes as well. But does anybody have the 2012 Black Bow in their cellar or not? As I said, I'm always looking for a reason to open the 12. Not that I don't know how it tastes like, because I tasted it last week, but this is very, at least to me, like as I said, like there's a big debate between Francois and I, which is the best white wine we've produced. And he's for the 15 Black Bow. I'm for the 12. We'll probably be arguing about it when we're like, I don't know, 100 years old with no teeth left, sipping on those wines. I gotta say though, not to expose him, but recently I blinded him on the 2012 Black Bow, and he thought it was the 15. So there's that. But now this is a wine that some of you may have in the cellar because I don't know, was it last year or the year before? We didn't have any wines to release for Christmas, for the Christmas holidays. So it took, I think it was around 25 cases of the Black Bow, 2012, and released it. The vast majority of the wine is still, like it's originally like a 2,000 bottle production, so over 1,500 bottles. It's still here in library aging. It is done the absolute identical way as the 13, meaning 100% poudre, fermentation and élevage, but they cannot be more different in terms of the way they express themselves. And this is where you can actually compare, if you have both in your cellar and inside you're in a Riesling mood, what a warm vintage does, what a cool vintage does. While the 13 has like it's very rich in perfume, but the register of those notes like to me remind me of, like morning dew, um, you know, green apples, things that are green and white and fresh and very floral, like peonies, that kind of thing. Even, the salinity within it, some people would say like celery, cucumber, you have that cool freshness about it. In the 12, and if you have them side by side, you see the 12 is much more golden in color. Now, that color comes from nothing else but the skins themselves. Not because the wine's been aged differently or seen more oxygen or it's aged further. It's always had that golden color. And what this is a product of is that during that hot season, even with all the leaves that we had on the canopy, you still have these speckles develop on the skins of the grape from all the sunshine. They're like freckles. And when you press the wines, and we press very, very slowly, you have part of that color imbue the character of the wine and bring with it those, I call them like honey beeswax flavors. Now, structurally speaking, that's a wine of like deep, deep, deep immensity. So the only reason we haven't released it because it would be unfair to. It's always been good, but just as I was talking last week about wines that we try to keep back, it would be unfair to say, here's the wine, it drinks great, because we wouldn't release it otherwise. But if you want to know, like, its true greatness, wait for however many years. And we try to keep back as much as possible of those cuvées. And the 12 Black Bow, because as you can tell now, it's one of our like wild children, very close to our hearts. We decided to give it full honors and keep it back as much as we can. So when it decides to fully open, release it then, and then allow people to experience straight from the get-go of when they purchase it, like like what miracle Niagara Riesling is. I don't even want to say what mature Niagara Riesling is, because these wines are ageless. It takes them 6 years to even start opening up. The wine hasn't started aging. It will be opening up for who knows how many years, and then it'll start aging somewhere further down the line. So we are kind of toying with the idea of releasing the 2012 at some point this year or next year, but we haven't decided on it, just because it's reaching beautiful, beautiful stages of its life right now. But also every time we taste it, you're like, if this is how long it's taken you to get here, I'm sure there's a lot more in that glass or in that bottle for us to discover. And that being the Riesling, which we think will live the longest of the ones that we've made, we're trying to exercise as much patience as we can with it. Has anybody tried it? Give me 1 second. Everybody can see close. Ooh. Yeah, see, I was singing its praises the past couple of times. It's been quite open. I'm tasting it now, and it's like, rather closed, which it happens too. Like wines do open up and close, sometimes profoundly, sometimes not as much. But the biggest changes happen with the change of the seasons. So it might have been just opening because it felt like it's spring coming, and showing us a little bit of what it has inside. But anyway, if you see the 12 Black Bow at some point in the future, I'm not just like, everybody that knows me and that's been here or that's ever asked me about Riesling can tell you that for me, that bottle of wine is extra, extra special. I remember it was also my first harvest, so granted, I may be biased, like because of the personal connection there. But I also remember Francois saying, "This is one of the best." Like because as the juice is coming off the press, we taste the juice a lot, and him saying that's the best juice that he's tasted in his life, bar none. Not the best Riesling juice, not the best juice from Niagara, and that's a big pronouncement from somebody that's worked in pretty famous places along the world. So, and while I'm singing his praises, I just want to point out to the whole aspect. Like, I mean, again, personal interpretation of the 2012 Black Ball, deep connection with that wine. The other two are no lesser wines. If anything, the 17 would be the more the most accomplished one, because I can tell you, if we knew then in 12 or in 13 what we learned the year after in 14, we probably would not put them in Foudre, but we will allow for some concrete that would make the wines even better. The 17, in that sense, it's like it started with 15, very, very warm vintage, just like the 12, but like, unreleased, again, just because warm vintages, bigger structures keep them away. But the 17 is the first wine, the first Riesling that we've released that has that completeness of our, understanding so far of what will make or what makes Niagara Riesling great. I hope a lot of you are lovers of Riesling. I imagine you are if you want to hear about it. And I would encourage everybody, even if you think that a Riesling's just sweet, it's not. And you can get ready for a new world where it's going to get drier and drier and drier and drier. But in terms of our attitude towards our understanding of what Niagara, it's like really like where Niagara genius, like because it is genius, really shines. I mean, yes, Chardonnay, yes, Pinot Noir, yes, Gamay, yes, Cabernet Franc. We're gonna talk about it next week. But Riesling is that shining light because while the other ones are very, very good, they're still close to existing references. The Riesling, like the closest references you have to it, it's a little bit of Alsace, a little bit of Austria, but still carries its identity with a just pristine kind of transparency. You cannot mistake dry Niagara Riesling if you get used to it for anything else. And I really hope that more and more people in the area, more wineries, get inspired to allow the Riesling to do what it wants to do, because there, like in Riesling, we have some of the oldest vines in Niagara are Riesling. So in terms of complexity of material that's available, Riesling is not beaten by any other grape variety, and that kind of experimentation and embracing of that style can lead to many more examples of, like, I mean, Niagara's to what it is to me typical expression, what is to the VQA Niagara atypicity. And as I said, the only problem we have with embracing that is not through, all sommeliers love it, work with it. So do, like you, our private customers. So do our foreign markets. The only people that have a problem with dry Riesling coming from Niagara is the VQA tasting panel. And I think that's hilarious. But also, it is just prevents from the development or the evolution within an area that we all should be, celebrating for its intricate and original identity. and not for its similarity to different wines. How am I doing for time? Oh my God, it's already 3:45. Here I am with the Riesling. Well, I hope you guys you enjoyed it. I hope you have some Rieslings. If you have any black bows in your cellars, apart from the three we have here, as I said, 17, drink it now, but also put some away because it will be extraordinary wine. Drink it now if you want to educate yourself about the youth of Niagara Riesling. 13, absolutely gorgeous if you have a special situation or really want to sit outside, enjoy the sun whenever it comes, like, spring. It is beautiful, like Riesling weather. Like 13 is the kind of wine that it feels like food. It's not only wine, it nourishes you. You don't like, I mean, you can absolutely do pair it with all sorts of foods, but it's sort of, I would always say, pair, like with a wine like that, you pair the food to the wine as opposed to vice versa. 12, the same thing if you're one of the people that have it. If you happen to have 11 black bow or 14 black bow or 10 for that matter, even though I haven't had that one in a while, 11 and 14 are wines, again, from years with much more like delicate structure, much more open. So they're beautiful and they have this like creamy, especially the 14. I had a bottle with our winery staff last night. It has a beautiful, beautiful creaminess, like almost like a Chenin Blanc, like a good Chenin Blanc, and it's delicious. And it's a wine that, I mean, it can definitely go just as the 11 can go. But if you feel like you wanna have an experience of a Riesling that's hitting its prime big time, those are the two vintages that you should be concentrating on: 2011 and 2014. Would love to drive up and do a tasting of the 12. I am down. I'm always down for tasting of the 12. As soon as everything goes back to whatever normal is, it's like, this is my, like, you know, how you like, it's not even a weak spot, but sometimes people would tell me, like, would send me an email and say, it's like, hey, I'm a real fan of the 12 without having heard me talk about it. And I'm like, I like you already. This is how it goes. That's for me, the 2012 Riesling is the key to my heart. But hope you guys enjoy it. Please, again, as always, feel free to send me an email. And again, don't hesitate in drinking Riesling. It is like up there with the best of the world, and can give you pleasures that few other wines can. Also, don't hesitate to age good Rieslings, because the pleasures that will await you will only accumulate. It's truly, truly, like, they talk about noble grape varieties, even though now that's become a little bit of a question mark, what makes a noble grape variety. But if there was one or two, Riesling is definitely up there with the best of them. So thank you all. And again, Svetlana at pearlmorissette.com. Well, you all have it because it's in the confirmation email. Any questions that I haven't covered, or or just send me questions that you're interested in learning about. Because after the Madeleines that we're gonna do next week, it's gonna be open game until I come up with all sorts of other crazy ideas. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you soon, I hope. Thank you.